Chapter 11 Meeting the Uncle. Once again you are listening at Novel Full. Audio. A brief flash of astonishment showed in Ling Mo Han's penetrating jet-black eyes, a fleeting moment, surprised that he would see the little beggar once more at a place like this. He had thought that the little beggar would have run away at the first sign of danger he would undoubtedly encounter in the 9 Entrapment Woods, and he had not for a moment expected to come all the way so deep into the inner reaches of the woods. He had spotted the little beggar sometime in the afternoon. The young beggar had been bent over digging up a herb from the ground. The herbs that he had thought to be useless were instead picked by the little beggar one by one, and the youth was seemingly extremely carefree and at ease within the inner reaches, looking completely oblivious to all the dangers surrounding him. Based on his cold and indifferent personality, he would not have paid the little beggar any attention. But somehow, for no good reason, he did not leave. Instead, he secretly observed from a distance, watching the little beggar intently as he picked up a piece of dead wood and dug out a small hole in it. He then found himself a small dead branch, and he sat down, placing the point of the branch into the small hole in the bigger piece of wood and turning the branch furiously, held between his palms, seeming like he was trying to bore a hole in the wood. He did not know what the little beggar was doing, and it was only after watching him for about more than 2 hours that he saw a thin wisp of smoke emanating from the piece of wood that he was thoroughly shocked. With just 2 pieces of wood and he was able to start a fire. He had never seen anyone use such a strange method before. He knew that to start a fire, people usually used either a stick of glowing ember or flint stones. In the worst-case scenario, he had heard that people would even strike 2 weapons together to induce sparks, but through the method like what the little beggar just did, that was a first in his entire life. But that also told him that the little beggar had not been oblivious to the surrounding dangers. The youth had had the mind to extinguish the fire after he roasted and ate the skillfully skinned snake before clambering quickly up a tall tree to find a place to rest for the night. The young beggar had been callously inconsiderate, as he could hear the kid snoring loudly all the way here. If Ling Mo Han knew what Feng Jiu was thinking in his mind at that moment, he might not having the same thoughts. Initially, Feng Jiu had not noticed that someone was watching him, as she had not sensed any malicious intent in the air surrounding her. But, just as she was up in the tree and had just closed her eyes to go to sleep, she suddenly felt that a pair of eyes were trained on her, probing and assessing her. And because of that, she let out loud snores, pretending to be deeply fast asleep. In reality, she was wondering when those eyes had started watching her, and how did she fail to notice that she was being watched? But since the other party had not chosen to show himself, and not caused her to feel threatened in any way, she decided not to expose the person hidden in the darkness, but chose to silently raise her guard. After all, the people in this world cultivated immortality, and she could not afford to carelessly see them as an average human, or she would put herself at a big disadvantage right from the start. At dawn the next morning, Feng Jiu awoke under the chirping of the birds. She reached one hand out groggily before giving out a mighty huge yawn, and she stretched her back fully in a graceful arc. But that full stretch caused her to lose her balance, and she suddenly fell from the tree. Arg! Bam! She screamed out and fell to the ground with a loud bang, lying among the tall grass on the ground. Ouch! This hurts like hell. She stood up and rubbed at her hips and twisted her body before heaving a sigh of relief. Luckily nothing is broken. A distance away, the dense canopy of leaves half covered the figure of Ling Mo Han as his penetrating eyes glanced briefly at the figure a way off from his position before quickly looking away. From the moment the little beggar had awoken, his eyes had been open. He had seen the little beggar still groggy with sleep as he stretched high above the trees and falling off it. He knew the ground below the tree was filled with weeds growing on soft soil, and a fall like that would not cause much problems, hence he had just glanced over unsympathetically and had not bothered to go help the youth up. He saw the little beggar rub at his hips and then proceed to find 2 sizable pieces of rocks before sitting down to pull out the herbs he had previously gathered from his clothes. He then mashed them up and stuffed it into his mouth. Ling Mo Han could not help himself but made his brows tilt up in a deep frown as he stared at the little beggar and thought to himself. The little beggar had just eaten roast snake last night. Was he so quickly famished that he needed to eat the herbs to quell his hunger? Even if that is the case, you can't stuff herbs into your mouth in such a manner, can you? Doesn't he know that eating herbs indiscriminately like this might cause you big problems? He was just thinking that when he saw the little beggar suddenly gagged and he vomited out a dark mouthful of blood before collapsing onto the ground. Chapter 12 Uncle's First Kiss. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When his eyes saw the scene, his arrow-straight brows furrowed into a frown as he stared and thought deeply about it. Half a heartbeat later, he still saw no sign of the little beggar awakening before he summoned his powers and leapt off the tree to walk in that direction. Dead. He stuck out a foot and nudged the unmoving figure a bit. When he saw that there was no reaction, he squatted down and wanted to check to see if the little beggar was still breathing. Who knew that at the very moment he had just lowered himself, the motionless little figure suddenly leapt up and pounced on him. In his state of unpreparedness, he was caught completely off guard and he was pushed onto the ground. Uncle. Ha ha ha. Ha. Feng Jiu was laughing hysterically when she suddenly stopped, and the expression on her face froze. She stared at the startled uncle lying on the ground and then turned her eyes to look at the dirty claws clasped upon her chest. Her entire being froze and she was dumbfounded at that moment. What? What is this? Had she just been molested? The feeling of soft flesh under his hands made Ling Mo Han's mind turn completely blank. Utter shock filled his eyes and stuttering for the first time in his life, he said. You are a girl. And he quickly retracted his hands as he spoke. But with the sudden release of his hands, the blanked-out Feng Jiu still had not recovered, causing her body to suddenly lose its support. Feng Jiu fell forward and in the worst way it could happen, her mouth smacked straight right onto a pair of bushy bearded lips. MMH. The two of them groaned under their locked lips as the pain from the impact shot through their mouths. This time, Ling Mo Han was the one to freeze, his eyes flared wide open, filled with utter incredulity. And as if he was terrifyingly shocked by something, his eyes rolled back and he fell into a dead faint. When she saw that the uncle had fainted, Feng Jiu's expression turned dark. She got up and massaged her face which was hurting from being pricked by the bushy and bristling beard, and spat out repeatedly going. Pooey. Pooey. Pooey, as she wiped at her mouth in disgust. I have not even complained about an old cow like you feeling up a pure and innocent young girl and you have the cheek to faint before me. She rubbed at her dirt-streaked face and stared at the really unconscious uncle and suddenly felt speechless. After she processed the herbs needed for the antidote, she had mashed them together and tried to swallow it. But the effects had been too strong and it caused her body to vomit out blood. She had then quickly decided to grab at that opportunity to lure the person hidden in the shadows to see who it was. She had not expected to hear that uncle's voice and she wanted to play a trick on him. Who knew she would end up being taken advantage of and was even forced to witness the man shocked into a dead faint after having taken liberties with her body. She sat down at the side with her legs crossed and she took the opportunity to observe the man before he woke up, and she found that the uncle was actually rather good-looking. Although half of his face was covered by the bushy beard, but his arrow-straight brows, his highly pointed nose, with his strong chiseled jawline, and those sexy lips hidden under the beard, somehow exuded a kind of manliness all over. Her eyes filled with admiration, her gaze slowly traveled downwards, over that strong and buff body, and those long and muscular legs, and she nodded in approval as she thought to herself. This physique would be the type when they put on clothes, they look stylish, and when they took off clothes, they look manly. Without even needing to check, he would undoubtedly possess the full set of abdominal muscles. Her hand was just involuntarily reaching out to feel the abdominal muscles when at that moment, a cold and hard voice rang in her ears. What are you doing? Ling Mo Han's eyebrows were tilted up at an alarming angle as he stared at her, before quickly flipping himself to stand up and putting some distance between them. At the first moment he had awoken, he was suddenly confronted with seeing her with her eyes brightly lit as she stared over his body. Although he saw only admiration in those eyes, but, was it really appropriate for a girl to be staring at a man with eyes like those? Those claws had just began to reach out when she heard his voice, and she immediately tried to, as naturally as possible, move her hands to scratch at her head, before saying sheepishly with a laugh, "Uncle, I wasn't going to do anything. TSK. Why did you have so wake up so quickly? I had wanted to feel those abdominal muscles." Chapter 13 Thick Hide Plaster. You are listening at novelfull.audio. He stared at the grinning girl before him, looking back at him with sparkling vigor in her eyes, when he recalled the softness his hands had grasped earlier and the touch when their lips had met. In a moment, his face darkened, but his face was covered by his great bushy beard and it could not be seen. Seeing the man turn and walk off without a word, Feng Jiu was surprised a moment. She thought about it for a while before she opened up her strides and followed. "Uncle, don't you think we are fated to meet? See? We've even managed to meet once again in here. Since that is the case, shouldn't we just travel together?" When the man continued striding on, completely ignoring her, she didn't feel the least bit bothered by it. She was thinking just with her own meager power alone and wandering aimlessly in this place, it might just be a tad bit dangerous. But if she were to be with a man like him, it would be a lot safer for her. Hence, whenever he walked, she followed, and when he stopped, she would also stop. But compared to her completely heartless lack of concern, the cold chill that was emanating from Ling Mo Han's being in front was growing more and more intense. At last, when he could not bear it any longer, he swung a chilling gaze onto her and his face creased up in a deep frown as he said, "Why do you have to keep following me?" He knew himself to be a person who wasn't exactly all that approachable. All this while, which human didn't stay beyond a 3-step boundary away from him whenever they saw him? Even the most tactless of people when chased off by him repeatedly would not be so shameless as to continue following him. But this girl was just like a thick hide plaster, one that he could not shake off no matter what he did. "Because you are the only person I know here." She looked at him like it should be obvious to see, her eyes trying to hide that mischievous glint. But her face betrayed not a thing and was serious as she said, "From the moment you gave me that nugget of silver, I was certain of it. You must be a really kind person." Green veins bulged alarmingly on Ling Mo Han's forehead and a corner of his brow started to twitch. His thin lips stretched into a straight line, and his flinty gaze was cast upon her a brief moment and he continued walking forward without another word. If he had known earlier that his carelessly tossed out little nugget of silver would give him such a persistent piece of thick hide plaster, he wouldn't have thrown out that piece of silver no matter how much of a hindrance it would cause him. The heavens knew that it wasn't out of kindness that he had given out that tiny piece of silver, but it just so happened that he had that one small piece of loose silver in his belt and he had happened to spot a little beggar in front, so he had thoughtlessly tossed it out. Who knew? Following behind Ling Mo Han, Feng Jiu noticed that he was moving in deeper into the woods and her eyes flashed momentarily as she looked at the figure in black and asked, "Uncle, I heard that there are ferocious beasts in the deeper reaches, is that true?" She had not expected to hear any reply, but his cold voice sounded out with careless indifference to reach her ears. "Since you know that, hurry up and leave that, uncle. I'll just stay beside you and pick some herbs and I promise not to give you any trouble." She had just checked her pulse and a large part the poison in her body had been purged with the blood she had vomited out earlier. She would only need to take another dose of the antidote tonight and she should be just about fine. She had initially intended to leave the 9 entrapment woods after she manages to fully purge the poison from her body, but who knew that she would meet the uncle once again. So she had changed her mind and decided to follow beside him to pick more herbs. Although she had managed to come into the inner reaches of the woods, it was nevertheless still just the inner reaches of the outer edge. Now that she was going to follow him deep into the real inner reaches, she could not help but feel a little excited and her heart was filled with anticipation. Wonder what kind of wondrous herbs will they have in there. It is said that the more dangerous the place, the more highly possible it is to be able to pick magical herbs. It would be just fantastic if she really manages to find some magical herbs, as even if she was not able to find a use for it, that would most definitely at least fetch her a hefty sum. Moreover, her looks had been destroyed to such a sorry state by Su Ruoyun, and even she herself thought she looked horrifying. She would naturally need to find a way to treat the wound on her face, or if she was forced to live with a face like that, that would just be an insult to her devilish reputation. Chapter 14. A mere beggar. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The two of them walked one behind the other. Because of Ling Emo Han's warning, despite her still following, she maintained a distance of 3 steps away from him. And she knew as well that the uncle was not used to being in close proximity to women, or he wouldn't have fallen into a dead faint after being accidentally kissed by her. Although she didn't feel that comfortable about that as well, but the other party was after all already an uncle who was old, it would be better if she did not bring up the incident anymore to avoid making it awkward for both parties. But something was making her mood improve. The deeper they went into the inner reaches following behind him, she managed to pick quite a bit of magical herbs along the way. Those magical herbs were infused with spirit auras, and although they were magical herbs of the more common variety, it was nevertheless enough for her mood to gradually lighten. Is that the red clover blossom? Those are the best for treating external wounds. Having spotted the bunch of magical herbs growing wild among the weeds, she ran over in joy and picked it carefully. The red clover blossom was after all a magical herb that would be worth quite a tidy sum, and they could only be found here in the deep inner reaches, never once having appeared the outer reaches. These magical herbs were actually the same as the most precious of herbs that she had known in the 21st century. Whether it was the name or the portrayal of the herbs, they were exactly the same. The only difference was that the people in this world cultivated mystical powers and spirit auras, and their herbs were mainly magical, infused with spirit auras, enhancing and amplifying their effects. Swoosh! At that moment, a chilling swishing sound was shooting straight towards her. Feng Jiu, who was carefully picking the magical herb, did not even look up as she dodged to one side quickly. At that moment, the red clover blossom had already been picked and she was holding it in her hands. Hearing the noise from in front, Ling Emo Han turned his head back immediately. The hands hanging at his sides had raised when the sharp arrow had been flying towards the little beggar. But when he saw her having nimbly dodged it, he discreetly put his hands back and turned his eyes towards the people coming from the other side. Feng Jiu was staring at the spot that she had just been squatting in that now had a sharp arrow lodged in the ground. If she had not been quick enough to leap away, that arrow would have landed in her body. Faced with such an unprovoked near brush with death, her lips split into an unthreatening smile, but her eyes did not show the slightest tinge of mirth as they looked at the people approaching. BDNV. It was a team that had about 20 people. The leader among them was a middle-aged man looking calm and steady. Beside him, was a younger male roughly about 20 years of age and a young girl of about 15 or 16. Behind them, the men were all dressed uniformly in the same liveries, looking like members of a clan, and the entire group seemed like they were a clan out here on a training mission. Observing the group without making any moves, Feng Jiu's eyes fell upon the young girl. She saw that the girl was dressed in a suit of pink gauzed tube dress, her voluptuous chest half exposed looking highly alluring, her slender waistline tightly bound, a mystical bow in hand and a quiver of arrows across her back. It was obvious, the arrow that flew straight at her earlier had been shot by the girl. Hand over the red clover blossom. The young girl's gaze was filled with arrogance as she stared at the filthy and messy Feng Jiu, and sneered. A mere beggar, not squatting by street corners to beg but coming out here to seek death, you must be tired of living. Feng Jiu did not hide her scrutinizing gaze as her eyes looked at the girl from head to toe, and she copied the girl's sneering tone in sarcastic mimic and said. Why are you not staying back at the brothel but have come all the way out here to put your flesh out on display? Who are you trying to seduce? Once Feng Jiu's words came out of her mouth, Ling Mo Han, who was standing in front, felt the corner of his mouth give a twitch, and inwardly, he shook his head and thought to himself. How can she be a girl? She's obviously just a uncouth ruffian. When the men on the girl's side heard that, their expressions hardened, and their murderous gazes threw endless daggers at Feng Jiu. Only their leaders and the young man's expression did not change, except that their eyes were looking at Feng Jiu as if they were looking at a dead corpse. You're asking for death. Chapter 15 Extortion out of convenience. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The young girl was stunned at that moment, her face one of pure disbelief, unable to accept as fact that she had been overpowered by a little beggar who stole the dagger from her and that she had been caught. What shocked her even more was that the little beggar had been so brazen as to have taken advantage of her before so many pairs of eyes. This niece of mine has been spoilt and have gotten too used to her willful ways. If she has offended you in any way, I implore for the young master to forgive her. A deep voice filled with inspiring awe sounded, and Feng Jiu raised her eyes to look at them, her eyes narrowed. The one who had spoken had naturally been the middle-aged man. He had spoken not in threat, but in apology. The fact that he had been able to suppress the rage in his heart and maintain a composed expression despite his displeasure to speak to her in such an amicable manner was really surprising. So when used to being spoilt and willful means you can indiscriminately take the lives of others. If I had not been quick to dodge, I am guessing I would have reported to the king of Hades already. She glared icily at the middle-aged man, her mouth curled up in a mirthless smile. To not reciprocate in kind would be rude. Actually, I should really repay the pretty lady back. As she spoke, the dagger pressed against the young girl's neck was pushed down a notch, and a drop of blood flowed out, glaringly red against the fair white skin. Ow! The young girl snapped back to consciousness from the sudden pain. As the dagger was pressed against her neck, she stiffened her body and did not dare move an inch, her face filled with fear and panic to say. You don't do anything rash. Ops. Really sorry. I got frightened by the arrow you shot at me earlier and my hands are still trembling. Seems like I have made you bleed. Watching the scene before him, the middle-aged man's face darkened. His previously amicable expression quickly faded. He stared at Feng Jiu and asked in a deep voice. What do you really want? Hearing that, Feng Jiu's eyes smiled. I'm not being demanding, but I was thinking if I have something golden or those silvery things to calm my nerves, my hands might not tremble anymore. When the middle-aged man heard that, his face relaxed a little instead as he signaled the young man beside him. The young man nodded and strode forward, before retrieving an inconspicuous little bag from his hip, and took out 2 solid gold ingots. What about us giving these 2 gold ingots to the young master to calm your nerves? At that moment, Feng Jiu's eyes discreetly glanced past the young man's inconspicuous little bag quickly. According to the memories in her head, that should be a cosmos sack that could hold many things, an item priceless on the market. Looks like this group of people were not from a simple background. She turned her gaze onto the 2 gold ingots in the man's hand and sneered. You're shooing off a beggar. 2 gold ingots and you think it can calm my nerves? The young man's face stiffened, eyeing the filth-covered little beggar before him as he thought. Aren't you exactly one? Although his heart was filled with contempt, his face however betrayed nothing as he took out another 4 good ingots. Will this be enough? Ling Mo Han glanced at the several good ingots and he silently looked away. Silver and gold ingots like this would only be able to buy them material things. To buy things for the purpose of cultivation, it would not be possible without crystal currency. Compared to the highly prized crystal currency, these gold ingots really paled in comparison. However, that little beggar had not asked for anything else the moment she had opened her mouth, but for gold and silver things, which was just dumb. Feng Jiu could not be bothered how others would think. She looked at the several gold ingots and her gaze turned up as she said. We will be even after this. After I let her go, all of you must not come after me. Naturally. The middle-aged man agreed in his deep voice. What do you say? She leaned close onto the young girl's face and asked smilingly of her. Chapter 15.1 Strange Skills. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Misty Cloud Translations Editor. Misty Cloud Translations. The young girl screamed out in humiliation, but it was not known whether it was from rage of embarrassment when her face turned bright red, and without thinking she raised the bow in her hand once more, pulling out an arrow from the quiver on her back to take aim at Fengjiu before releasing the string. Swoosh! The ruthless arrow had been imbued with mystical aura as it sped towards Fengjiu's heart with blinding speed, fully intent on taking Fengjiu's life in one strike, chillingly merciless. The men with the girl did not move in the slightest, the leader seemingly intentionally indulgent. After all, from what they were seeing, Fengjiu was just a mere little beggar who possessed zero mystical powers, who might perhaps have been extremely lucky to be able to make it all the way in here. And for a person like that, they all would be able to get rid of easily just by barely lifting a finger. Just a few steps away from Fengjiu, Ling Mo Han did not do anything to stop the attack this time. He wanted to see just how capable the little beggar girl was. From his observation of her, the little beggar girl was not brainless. In fact, she had shown herself to be extremely shrewd and astute, never committing something she wasn't confident of. The only thing was, it was obvious she did not possess the slightest sliver of mystical aura within her body, so from where was she getting the confidence to provoke others so readily? As he thought to himself, his gaze steeled. He saw her somersault with great agility to avoid the speeding arrow, shooting past under her, not injuring her in the slightest. Beyond witnessing the scene, not only Ling Mo Han, but even the middle-aged man and the younger man on the other side showed a glint of surprise in their eyes. Without the slightest sign of any mystical power on the opponent, and knowing full well how chillingly fast that arrow that was shot out had been traveling, they were certain that the little beggar should not have been able to dodge it at all. But the little beggar had done just that. That just meant that the little beggar was not someone as simple as he was portraying himself to be. Damn! The young girl stamped her feet in frustration and reached her hand behind her back to retrieve another arrow to string onto her bow before pulling back to shoot another one out. But not a single one of those arrows carefully aimed at the little beggar could hit him. After her next several successive attempts hit nothing but air, she stared at the little beggar looking smilingly at her with his chin resting nonchalantly in his palm, seemingly saying to her in ridicule. "Is that all you've got?" She got so angry that she kept her mystical bow, before pulling out the dagger at her hip to charge straight at the little beggar. "Are you sure you want to do this? Any more and I will not hold back." The smile on Fengjiu's face suddenly looked strange, as her eyes swept over the girl's ample bosom briefly and Fengjiu charged straight towards the dagger being thrust at her instead of avoiding it. "Damned beggar! You shall die." Ling Mo Han's gaze was fixed on Fengjiu as she moved, and he only saw Fengjiu disarming the young girl of her dagger in a blink. The speed that it had been carried out was too fast for him to even see how she had accomplished the feat. The next moment, the dagger was already in Fengjiu's hand, and with a quick step, she was suddenly behind the young voluptuous girl, and Fengjiu's hand had even slid over the young girl's snowy white exposed skin in a soft caress, which made him suddenly find himself at a complete loss of words. Is that really a girl under those tattered clothes? That really isn't a shameless ruffian hidden beneath. Woo-hoo, so smooth. Fengjiu exclaimed in praise, her eyes narrowed lustily, with one hand wrapped around the young girl's slender waist, the other holding the dagger in a reverse grip pressed against the smooth white neck, looking like she was intentionally teasing the young girl, even bringing her face close to the trapped girl's neck to sniff at it, and putting on a face intoxicated with euphoria. "That smells just absolutely heavenly." This time, even the stoically stone-faced middle-aged man's face changed, turning a few shades darker. The young man beside him was filled with rage, his eyes aflame in anger, his hands within his sleeves clenched tightly into fists. If not for the young buxomy girl trapped in the enemy's hands, he would not have been able to contain himself and would have charged straight in. Ling Mo Han was still speechless and he averted his eyes, unable to make himself watch any longer. Chapter 16 Uncle, do these things eat people? You are listening at novelfull.audio. The young girl's teeth were tightly clenched as she nodded. As long as you let me go, I will not make any moves against you. After hearing that, Feng Jiu signaled for the young man to bring the gold ingots over. The young man walked over, gave the young girl a glance, and handed the gold ingots in his hands to Feng Jiu. Feng Jiu received it and immediately shoved it into her robes before moving the dagger away and tossing it towards the young man. The young man stepped slightly back to catch the dagger and at the same time, the young girl turned back and raised a leg to kick out at Feng Jiu. You damned little ruffian! You dare touch me! Feng Jiu had not let her guard down. After receiving the gold ingots, she had immediately retreated quickly and the young girl's kick had been in vain. The young girl wanted to rush forward but at that moment, the middle-aged man's deep voice boomed out. Ingro, come back. Second uncle. The young girl stamped her feet, unwilling to let the matter end just like that. But when she saw her second uncle's gaze in warning, and her elder brother's signal with his eyes, she bit down on her lip and slunk her way back to the group. On the other side, Feng Jiu was finding the 6 gold ingots in her chest rather heavy and afraid that they would crush the magical herbs kept in the same location. She took the gold out and showed them off to Ling Mo Han saying, Uncle! See how much money I have. What do you say you let me treat you to some wine later? Ling Mo Han cast a glance at her and immediately opened up his stride to walk away while Feng Jiu quickly followed hollering. Hey uncle! Go a little slower won't you? Watching as the two people leave one behind the other, the young man's eyes suddenly gave a flash filled with murder and he asked. Second uncle, why do we not kill that brat? That blank-robed man is no ordinary man. Even I was unable to fully ascertain that man's level of cultivation and that little kid is also very strange. He obviously had not practiced any cultivation but still possessed such skills, he's definitely not just a mere beggar. His voice paused a moment before he continued. We have more important things to take care of on our trip. So do not stir up unnecessary trouble and this matter ends here. Do not bring it up again. Yes. Although deeply disgruntled, they could do nothing but agree to it. After all, compared to the mission at hand on this trip, the matter with the kid was really insignificant. When she recalled the purpose of the mission at hand, the young girl finally swallowed back her resentment and rage and then asked in excited anticipation. Second uncle, have mythical beasts really been born into the 9 entrapment woods? I believe that the respective families will get wind of the news in turn and come to this 9 entrapment woods or they might already be somewhere around. So, we will have to move fast to not miss out on the opportunity. The middle-aged man nodded as his gaze turned to look deep into the 9 entrapment woods, his eyes strongly determined. Hearing his second uncle's words, the young man thought on it a moment and asked. Could it be possible that those 2 people are here seeking the mythical beasts as well? I saw them going in a direction deeper in and I am guessing that they targeting at the same goals as us. The middle-aged man's eyes was suddenly filled with vicious malice as he said in his deep voice. If that is true that we're after the same thing, then we will look for an opportunity to kill them along the way. And he led the team forward, going deeper into the woods as he spoke. Up front, Ling Mo Han who had not gone much further suddenly stopped in his tracks, the gaze in his set of deep eyes turned sharp and cold as he scanned the surroundings cautiously. Feng Jiu saw him stop and took the chance to remove the outer coat on her, quickly twisting it up into a simple makeshift bundle before taking out the herbs she had picked along the way all this time from inside her robes to put them in. Next, she then retrieved the gold ingots and stuffed them in after that, before finally tying the bundle sack tightly across her body. Although the clothes she was wearing were the tattered clothes of a beggar, she had worn several layers of them, hence, removing a piece or 2 of them did not matter much to her. But, when she finished tying up the bundle and lifted her head, she was suddenly startled. From in between the trees surrounding them, she saw several sharp-fanged unidentifiable bestial forms, their bodies big as oxen, stepping out warily, and she blinked her eyes as she asked. "Uncle, do these things eat people?" Chapter 17 First Glimpse of the Honed Edge. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Roar. The response she heard had not come from Ling Mo Han but an ear-splitting roar of rage from the ferocious beast before her eyes. The moment the fierce roar sounded, the massive and ferocious beasts had immediately coiled up and pounced towards the two of them, their wide jaws salivating heavily, exposing long fangs that gleamed, thirsting for blood, a sight that made people shiver in fright. Up the tree. Ling Mo Han's icy gaze swept around, as he hollered in a deep voice. Upon hearing his call to climb the trees, a wide smile came onto Feng Jiu's face. She had said that the uncle was a nice man. "Uncle, you be careful yourself too." She slipped quickly up a huge tree beside her nimbly and hugged a wide branch to look down at the scene below, eager to see what kind of moves the uncle would be able to throw out. But when she spied out of the corner of her eyes from her high vantage point the young man hidden behind them holding up a bow aimed right at the uncle below her, a cold coming glint immediately flashed in her eyes. Her mind raced as she saw one of the ferocious beasts ramming itself into the big tree she was on. She released the arm hugging the branch and timed herself to fall off the tree at the same moment of impact from the beast's ramming. Aw! Engaged with more than 10 of the ferocious beasts, Ling Mo Han instinctively turned his head back to look and his face darkened slightly. The troublesome one. He was about to summon his powers to catch her when he saw her wink at him. Upon seeing that, his eyebrows creased together as he swung his sword at the ferocious beast charging in at him. At the same moment, after Feng Jiu fell to the ground, she immediately picked up her legs and ran screaming. "Arg! Help!" Her movements were queer. Obviously not possessing a sliver of mystical aura as she ran around haphazardly among the ferocious beasts, she had somehow avoided being hit. After running a circle around them, she did not run to hide behind Ling Mo Han but ended up running back the way they had come. "Help me!" The 10 over men hidden behind a clump of trees not too far away saw Feng Jiu running in their direction, with her being chased by 7 or 8 of those ferocious beasts, and their faces suddenly paled. "Damn it!" The young man cursed softly. He hadn't been able to get a good aim with the pulled-back bow in his hand due to the erratic movements of the black-robed figure in front of him, and when he saw the ferocious beasts running towards them, he knew his assassination attempt had flopped, hence, he quickly shifted the bow slightly to train his aim directly at the little beggar and released it. "Ready yourselves for battle." The middle-aged man shouted out and his mystical aura flared out as he whipped out the short sword at his hip. When she saw the young man release his arrow at her, the corners of Feng Jiu's mouth curled up like hooks, turning into a strange smile that looked decidedly sinister. Once bitten twice shy, against people who had repeatedly tried to take her life, she would however not repeatedly spare them theirs. Furthermore, her hands were beginning to itch. She would use this group of people to test her mettle in this world. Her targets determined, her murderous killer instinct swarmed out, a chilling aura filled with a conqueror's overwhelming presence flared. Just by the change in her eyes and the aura emanating from her being, it had caused the middle-aged man, their leader, to suddenly find his heart awash in illogical fear, shuddering in absolute terror. He had come across all kinds of people throughout his life, and he was acutely aware that the little beggar at this moment was a completely different person from before. His sudden dominating conqueror's presence, that chilling murderous aura, and that exhilarating air oozing with confidence within those eyes, was enough to make him tremble in fear. But, this person possessed not a shard of mystical power. He believed that no matter how strong an aura the little beggar was able to push out, there was no way the little beggar can overpower him in battle. Ling Mo Han's gaze fell into the little beggar girl as well, and his deep eyes flashed a bright glint. As expected, she wasn't such a harmless and simple girl as she portrayed herself to be. But thinking about it made him realize that he should have noticed the little beggar wasn't an ordinary person. What kind of an ordinary girl would dare to enter the 9 entrapment woods alone? However, without an ounce of mystical power in her, she would not be a match for those people. But very soon, he came to yet another realization that he had still underestimated her. Chapter 18 Overflowing with Murderous Aura. You are listening at novelfull.audio. He only managed to see the figure employ some strange moves to dodge the arrows speeding towards her, while leading 7 or 8 of those ferocious beasts towards the group of men. She coiled her legs as she landed, and immediately leapt up as her hands grabbed a tree branch as she spun. Making full use of the forward momentum, her feet kicked out, launching her off the tree, speeding like a bullet straight at her target. Naturally it was the young man with a bow still gripped in his hand. Quick! Dodge! The middle-aged man shouted out in shock. He had wanted to rush forward to drag the young man away, but the ferocious beasts had pounced towards him and he himself had his hands full. Where would he have the time to help him? Alas, he could only watch futilely as the little beggar flying speedily down, his foot fully extended. Fortunately, the young man had startled awake with the deafening shout and his body had taken a step back reflexively, narrowly avoiding the kick that Feng Jiu had aimed right at his head that would have taken his life. But he was still half a heartbeat too slow and he was still kicked in the face. The young man stumbled back a few steps from the impact and at that moment, a ferocious beast charged at him, but the young girl at the side blocked the blow for him. Elder brother! Snap out of it! The young girl shrieked, her voice panicked, her face filled with anxiety. The young man recovered at that moment and the burning pain on his face made his rage rise up in his heart. He kept the mystical bow and he diverted his mystical power into a surge. He gathered the mystical energy into his 2 fists and struck out. A loud bam resounded and the ferocious beast that had charged at him was suddenly sent flying from the impact. Howl! Bam! The ferocious beast howled in pain and its body crashed heavily to the ground, as the ground tremored slightly from the impact. When the guards saw that the young man had sent a whole beast flying with just 1 strike, they were suddenly stoked. Their eyes shone as they shouted. Young master is truly magnificent. As their hearts were boiling with battle lust, the confusion that had wreaked havoc among them having been caught off guard was suddenly quelled at that moment. Just shortly after, they had managed to kill all of the ferocious beasts. Several corpses of the beasts scattered in a mess on the ground, as the pungent stench of blood filled the air. After the crisis was averted, the group suddenly realized that there were another 7 to 8 corpses of the beasts in another area not too far away from them, obviously slaughtered by the lone black-robed man. But the black-robed man was nowhere in sight, and not only that, the little beggar and their second uncle were missing as well. Elder brother, where is second uncle? The young girl peered around into the surroundings, but did not see any signs of them. The young man raised a hand to wipe off a tinge of blood from the corner of his mouth, his eyes staring maliciously into a specific spot. He did not speak, but instead returned the mystical bow to her, and suddenly started walking off to his left. The young girl and the guards immediately hurried to follow behind him. Under the cover of the dense canopies, the murderous aura was overflowing and even the air had turned colder as the chilling aura permeated and spread. The middle-aged man's keen gaze was locked onto Feng Jiu, his low voice was chilling as he said. You are not a match for me. There is no need for you to put up a useless struggle. Really? Feng Jiu's hooked smile appeared and from her entire being, murderous aura surged out thickly. The middle-aged man snorted heavily as if mocking her for her strong confidence. He summoned his mystical powers and imbued it into the sword in his hand, its honed tip suddenly surging forward the very next moment. Clang! The dagger clashed against the sword, and a loud clang rang out, sending sparks flying. At almost the same moment, the 2 weapons in their hands had been flipped and went already executing another strike immediately. After several passes, the sword struck out mercilessly as it thrust straight towards Feng Jiu. The sword's edge was further honed with sword's aura, that would not allow her to dodge. On a tree just a short distance away, Ling Mo Han saw the scene clearly, and his straight brows cringed together. The very next moment, his gaze changed when he saw Feng Jiu's subsequent actions, not really expecting it. Chapter 19 Rolling with the Power Encounter. You are listening at novelfull.audio. That sword thrust had seemed to be impossible for her to avoid. But against all expectations, at the very moment when the point of the sword was about to pierce into her chest, her body fell backwards in a flash, and with the force from the backward flip, her hip gave a strong twist and she went into a spin, not only having avoided that lethal thrust of the sword, but the dagger gripped in her hand was also suddenly moving at a blinding speed towards the middle-aged man. The moment he found that Feng Jiu had avoided his sword thrust with her strong hips, the middle-aged man was shocked, and the murderous aura was already pressing in close before his eyes. He could not embark on another strike in that situation but to speedily retreat, but was still a tad too slow. Zock! He winced in pain, drawing in a cold gasp of air, his vicious gaze staring chillingly at the figure before him. Although he had barely managed to dodge the fatal strike, he had suffered a deep gash on his arm from the dagger that had bitten all the way to the bone. Ghastly red blood was gushing out, quickly soaking into his sleeve. The pain from the wound made his arm hang limply at his side, trembling violently. "BVEC, second uncle!" The young girl screamed out, quickly running over. "Kill him!" The middle-aged man spat out through gritted teeth. The guards responded immediately but were stopped by the young man's upraised hand. "I will deal with this little beggar myself." The young man's body was giving out a cruel and malicious air, as bloodthirsty scent hung thickly on him, the eyes fixed upon Feng Jiu exactly like a venomous viper. As she watched the middle-aged man being helped to the side by the young girl, Feng Jiu's eyes shifted to gaze at the young man whose being was giving out strong waves of malicious vibes. Her chin was lifted as she said, her voice laced with contempt. "You are not a match for me." Although she could feel rather stable vibes from the young man, but it was not on the same level as the middle-aged man. Even if she wanted to kill that middle-aged man, it would require her to at least execute several moves before she would be able to take his life. But for this young one before her now, she would not even need to break a sweat to do it. Still up in the tree a short distance away, as he watched her lift her chin slightly in arrogance, and spitting out her words with contempt, Ling Mo Han shook his head silently. She is still a little girl after all. But, from what he observed when she battled the middle-aged man earlier, he knew now that she would be able to take on that whole band of people by herself. With her skills, as long as she paid due caution within these inner reaches of the woods, she should not meet with any mishaps. With that thought, he stared intently at the figure a moment, before he summoned his power and leapt away into the distance. "Not a match for you. Ha! Then have a taste of what I am capable of." The young man shouted loudly, and the mystical power surged through his body. An orange glow from his mystical power flared out from his body. He clenched his fists and with a shout, he leapt out and threw a punch towards Feng Jiu. Ha! Seeing the orange glow from his mystical powers, Feng Jiu's eyebrow raised up. The middle-aged man's aura on his sword had also seemed to have been encased in a faint orange tinge. She had not expected that this man's mystical power cultivation was about the same as the middle-aged man's. 5-ton punch. Feng Jiu saw the wind behind his fist and she jumped back immediately. She saw that the young man's punch had toppled a large tree. After she dodged, she spotted a deep impression of a fist's mark left in the tree's trunk. She was secretly astonished. With cultivated mystical powers combined with martial arts, its resulting power was rather shocking to see. Her opponent attacked with his fists, every single swing immensely powerful. If she retaliated with force in counter, it would obviously not work. If that was the case, she would roll along with the immense power to counteract it. Her eyes flashed with clarity as she speedily retreated and kept away the dagger in her hand. After the young girl bandaged up her second uncle's wounds, she saw Feng Jiu putting away his dagger and she sneered in disdain. "Second uncle, has that little beggar lost his mind from shock? He had even kept his dagger away. Does he really think he can defeat my elder brother in a fist fight? The middle-aged man was instead looking at Feng Jiao thoughtfully, his eyes slightly doubtful, a nagging feeling of unease in his heart.